In a museum drawer in Madagascar, there is an impossibly heavy, unusually dense thigh bone, a femur, built to carry a load no living bird could possibly support. The animal it belonged to stood taller than a human. Estimates vary, but the largest species may have weighed over half a ton. Not the tallest bird ever, but certainly the heaviest. And this was not a predator. It was not fast. It did not need to be. It was a slow, massive herbivore moving through forests that no longer exist, under conditions that no longer apply. And then, of course, there were the eggs. An elephant bird egg could hold the contents of more than 100 chicken eggs. Each egg was not just large, it was a single, enormous reproductive gamble, so extreme it shaped everything else about how the bird lived. This is not a monster story. It is a system pushed to its absolute limits. A bird built at the very edge of what avian biology allows. A body plan stretched until there was no redundancy left, and certainly no room for error. A set of trade-offs so tight that when the conditions shifted, there was nowhere to adapt. So what does it cost to build a bird this big? And what kind of world allows it to keep working until it doesn't? The easy assumption is that elephant birds were giant ostriches, island versions of something familiar, scaled up by isolation after arriving in Madagascar. A classic case of island gigantism. But this is wrong. Elephant birds were not closely related to ostriches at all. Ancient DNA extracted from eggshell and bone shows that their nearest living relatives are actually kiwis, the fascinating, small, nocturnal, flightless birds living on the other side of the Indian Ocean. The connection is not obvious. A half-ton forest giant and a cat-sized night forager do not look like family, but the genetics are clear. These lineages share a common ancestor, separated by tens of millions of years and thousands of kilometres of open water. This changes the framing. The elephant bird was not simply big, it was a very specific kind of big, one that emerged from a lineage with particular tendencies, particular constraints, and particular ways of solving problems. To understand what it was, you have to understand where it came from, and that means setting aside the spectacle. This is not a story about being the largest. It is not about dominance or evolutionary success. It is about a system that worked only while the rules stayed stable. When the rules changed, size offered no protection at all. Madagascar is not like anywhere else. It separated from the Indian subcontinent around 80 million years ago and has remained isolated ever since. What evolved there stayed there. What arrived rarely. The result is an island where much of the wildlife exists nowhere else on Earth, a somewhat closed system running its own evolutionary experiment. For millions of years, that experiment included giants. Giant lemurs, giant tortoises, oversized carnivores, and among them a lineage of massive flightless birds, the elephant birds. Family Aeopornithidae. They were not a single species. Modern research recognises several elephant bird lineages, including Mulla ornis, representing smaller forms, and Aeopornis, the classic elephant bird of older literature, with Aeopornis maximus standing as the largest. In 2018, researchers proposed Vorombotitan as a separate genus and species, identifying it as the heaviest bird ever to have lived. But more recent work increasingly treats Vorombotitan not as a distinct lineage, but as the most extreme expression of Aeopornis maximus. Whilst that acknowledgement of course is important, for the sake of this video, much of what we're discussing here applies to the elephant birds as a whole, and it is the sheer extremes reached by the largest forms, Aeopornis maximus, that push the boundaries of what a bird could be, and that ultimately strain the system beyond its limits. We do not have complete skeletons for most of these birds. What we have are fragments, femurs, eggshells, scattered bones and inference. Enough to know they were real, enough to know they were enormous, not enough to reconstruct their lives in every single detail. What seems likely is that they occupied forested and semi-open habitats, feeding on fruit, seeds and vegetation. Large-bodied herbivores moving slowly through a landscape with few predators and little pressure to move fast. Certainly no need to fly, even if it was a possibility. And once flight is left behind, the usual bird blueprint stops applying. Getting big is not free. Mass increases faster than the structure that supports it. Double the height of an animal, and you do not double its weight, you multiply it. Bones must thicken, joints must widen. The energy required just to stand, just to move, rises sharply. For most birds, this is impossible. Flight, and in most cases its necessity to be efficient and relatively controlled, imposes a hard ceiling on body mass. Wings can generate only so much lift. Beyond a certain point, a bird cannot get off the ground. The largest flying birds alive today, bustards, swans, condors, already sit extremely close to that limit. Remove flight, and the ceiling lifts. But new problems also arrive immediately. A giant body cannot react quickly. It cannot accelerate, turn or flee the way a smaller animal can. Injury becomes more dangerous. A broken leg that a small bird might survive is catastrophic for an animal that cannot shift its weight or escape danger. Reproduction slows. Larger animals take longer to mature, longer to reproduce, and longer to replace. Each generation is a larger investment, and each loss is harder to absorb. Food demands also scale. A half-ton herbivore requires a vast, reliable supply of vegetation every single day. If that habitat shifts, there is no easy fallback. There is no second strategy. A giant body is not a victory, it is a commitment. You cannot turn quickly. You cannot breed quickly. You cannot hide. This is what the wrong order looks like. A creature that works only as long as nothing pushes it off its very narrow track. So how did the elephant birds work? Not through a single adaptation, but through a series of reallocations. Energy and structure shifted away from flight and toward an entirely different way of being a bird. Flight is expensive. It demands large chest muscles, a deep-keeled sternum, lightweight bones, and constant readiness for sudden bursts of power and energy. A flying bird carries this machinery everywhere, whether it uses it or not. Remove that requirement, and the budget opens up. Elephant birds reinvested. Their bones became dense and solid, built for load-bearing rather than lightness. Their legs were thick like columns, weight distributed over massive feet. The architecture begins to resemble a large mammal more than a typical bird. Slow, stable, efficient over distance rather than explosive in motion. Movement was most likely unhurried. Large herbivores rarely need speed. They need endurance, reach, and the ability to process large amounts of low-quality food. Everything about the elephant bird's frame points to a life measured in slow steps and long digestion. Their diet is harder to pin down because soft tissue doesn't fossilize. No stomach contents survive. So researchers look sideways, comparing elephant birds to other large flightless birds and island herbivores. The picture that emerges is fruit, seeds, and tough vegetation. A generalist browser rather than a specialist, at least in this part of its biology. And that matters, because it points to flexibility rather than refinement. A bird built to cope broadly, not optimized narrowly. And then, of course, there is the Kiwi connection. Kiwis are nocturnal. They navigate by smell and touch rather than sight. If elephant birds retained aspects of this sensory inheritance, and recent work on brain structure suggests they may have, then we are not looking at a familiar avian sensory world. In this case, darkness may not have offered an advantage, but the pressure to abandon it may simply have never existed. And so, this may have been another quiet abnormality of the elephant birds. Not something it needed, just something it never had to give up. A giant bird moving through forest in low light, relying on senses most birds abandoned long ago. Not oversized, not dominant, just very different in kind, and that distinction matters. In 2018, researchers revisited elephant bird skulls using CT scans to reconstruct brain structure. What emerges was subtle, but telling. The optic lobes, the regions responsible for processing vision, were reduced relative to overall brain size, not the neural architecture of a bird that relied heavily on sight. Instead, the olfactory bulbs were enlarged, disproportionately so, and the proportions were strikingly familiar. They matched, almost uncannily, of course, the brain structure of kiwis, which by now is probably not a surprise. Different scale, similar wiring, the same shift away from vision and towards smell, a sensory world built close to the ground where information comes from contact rather than distance. What this suggests is not certainty, but continuity, a lineage that carried forward a particular way of sensing the world and never encountered strong pressure to abandon it. Whether elephant birds were fully nocturnal, crepuscular, active at dawn or dusk, or simply less dependent on vision, is still uncertain. But what is clear is that their sensory world was narrow, tuned to a specific condition, specific environments, specific assumptions. And narrow systems, once established, tend to persist, right up until the moment they no longer work. Which brings us to the detail that define their lives more than any other: the egg. Elephant bird eggs are among the largest ever laid by any animal. A single egg could exceed 30 centimetres in length, with a volume equivalent to maybe 150 chicken eggs. Fragments still surface in Madagascar. Whole specimens sit in museums around the world, pale, thick-shelled, unmistakable. They are a spectacular object, but spectacle here is not the point. An egg this size is not just impressive, it is expensive. It represents an enormous investment of energy, calcium, minerals and time. A female producing an egg like this is committing a significant portion of her own resources to a single reproductive event. And that changes the mathematics of survival. Large eggs usually mean fewer of them, longer intervals between clutches, more time spent incubating, a slower replacement rate if something goes wrong. This strategy can work, but only in a stable world. If predation is low, if food supply is predictable, if nothing interferes with nesting, then investing heavily in a small number of well-developed offspring can be viable. The chicks hatch further along developmentally, better equipped and less dependent on extended parental care. But stability is the condition that makes it possible. If predators arrive, especially predators that target eggs, this equation reverses. Every nest becomes a single point of failure. Every lost clutch represents months of investment gone at once. Recovery is slow, if it happens at all. An egg this size is a bet on a world that does not change, on the idea that the narrow conditions it depends on will not shift suddenly or without warning. In the case of the elephant bird, the bet was lost. The elephant bird is gone. The question is why and when, and whether it could have ended up differently. The best current radiocarbon evidence places final extinction within the last 1,000 years. Some analysis narrowed a window further, suggesting the last populations disappeared between roughly 800 and 1050 CE. This is recent. Geologically, it is only yesterday. Humans arrived in Madagascar, but exactly when remains debated. Some evidence suggests an initial presence several thousand years ago, possibly longer. Other interpretations place sustained settlement significantly later. What is clearer is that major ecological transformation, widespread burning, forest clearance, and the introduction of livestock and dogs intensified in the last 2 millennia. The debate over what killed the elephant bird is not fully settled. Climate shifts occurred, habitats changed, periods of drought and aridification may have stressed populations already operating close to their limits. But the weight of evidence points towards human impact as the primary driver. Not necessarily through direct hunting alone. Elephant bird bones with clear cut marks are rare. Predation may have occurred, but it was not the dominant signal in the fossil record. What is easier to see is habitat loss, fire, forest conversion to grassland, pastoralism replacing the ecosystems the elephant birds heavily depended on. And then there, of course, is their eggs. An egg the size of a bucket, laid in a ground nest, is an obvious target. You do not need to kill an adult to collapse a population. You only need to disrupt reproduction, consistently across generations. Eggs are visible. Eggs do not flee. Eggs are food, and easy food at that. Whether or not humans deliberately targeted elephant birds, they transformed the world that these birds required. The forests shrank. The predators changed. Nest sites became exposed. And there were no backups. A system built to function within stable and narrow boundaries collapses quickly when these boundaries are moved. The elephant bird was not a failure. It was not a dead end or a mistake, or a creature too slow or too stupid to survive. Extinction was not inevitable because the system did not work. It did work remarkably well for the environment it evolved within. Where there were pressures, it found ways to accommodate them. Where there were limits, it operated carefully inside them. It was a negotiated solution, a body plan that worked for millions of years within a specific set of conditions. Low predation, stable forests, predictable food supply, enough time, each generation, to lay a single enormous egg and to see it through. Every part of that system was interconnected. Size depended on food supply. Reproduction depended on safety. Sensory ecology depended on habitat. Remove one element, and the others could not compensate because the system was already extremely tight. There was no excess capacity, no slack to absorb disruption. And that raises a broader question. Is this the cost of becoming very large, or the cost of becoming very specialised? The more tightly a system is tuned to a particular set of conditions, the less room it has to adjust when those conditions shift. What looks like success, scale, efficiency, precision, can also be a narrowing of options, a commitment made so completely that it cannot be undone quickly. The elephant bird did not fail suddenly. It lost the conditions that made it workable. This is what extinction often looks like. Not a dramatic hunt to the last animal, not a single catastrophe, just a gradual tightening of constraints until a narrow system has nowhere left to operate. As we have seen, the closest living relative of the elephant bird is a small nocturnal forager on the far side of the Indian Ocean, the kiwi. The same lineage, the same deep inheritance, a different set of trade-offs, shaped by a different place under different pressures. One survived, one did not. The difference is not necessarily intelligence or strength. The difference is fit to a moment, to an environment, to conditions that either held or shifted. The elephant bird had no spare systems, no fallback strategy. It worked only within those tight boundaries. When those boundaries moved, there was nothing left to negotiate. Not a monster, not a marvel, just workable, until it wasn't. These films take time to research and build. If you enjoy birds that sit at the edge of what makes sense, a like or subscribe genuinely helps, and we're extremely grateful. A comment or a share goes even further. Either way, thanks for watching. See you next time.